She teased, "Don't be so serious, relax with me." But what happens when the lines between playfulness and something deeper start to blur? The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the cozy living room where I found myself sitting, nursing a cup of coffee in the corner. I'd come to visit my friend, Mark, to unwind for the evening, expecting nothing more than casual conversation and a few hours of mindless chatter. But what I didn't expect was her. Mark's aunt, Laura, had dropped by. She wasn't like any other woman I had met before. At 42, she carried a quiet confidence that was impossible to ignore, yet there was a subtle vulnerability in her that made her approachable in a way that was rare for someone so poised. She had the kind of elegance that made you pay attention, even in a room full of people, but without making it obvious. It was as if she moved with a gentle authority, yet all the while, she exuded a sense of warmth that didn't match her sharp, polished exterior. She had entered the room just as Mark was pouring more coffee, her laughter trailing behind her as she spoke to him about some mutual acquaintance. I watched as she removed her coat, revealing the soft, simple sweater she wore, a muted shade of green that complemented her striking eyes. As she turned, her gaze met mine for the briefest of moments, and I felt a sudden tightening in my chest. She smiled politely, nothing too extravagant, but it was enough to send an unspoken message: I was noticed. Mark was quick to introduce us, but I could tell she wasn't looking at me the same way most people did. There was no forced nicety, no overly polite distance. Instead, there was a subtle curiosity in her expression, like she could sense something about me that others might miss. "Don't be so serious," she teased, her voice light yet knowing, as she playfully leaned against the doorframe. "Relax with me, you might actually enjoy yourself." Her words were casual, the kind that someone might say to break the ice, but the way she said them, light and teasing, but with an undercurrent of something softer, had an impact on me that I hadn't expected. It was the first time I had ever felt such a gentle, yet profound, pull towards someone so much older. She wasn't just marking time in the same way that most people her age did, she carried herself with a maturity that seemed to breathe life into everything she touched. The air in the room seemed to shift, just slightly, as I caught myself holding her gaze a moment longer than was polite. It wasn't the kind of look you could explain, but it was enough to make me feel like I was suddenly on the edge of something, teetering between the familiarity of friendship and the thrill of something new, something unspoken. Mark had already turned to speak to someone else, but Laura's eyes lingered just a moment longer, and in that brief exchange, I felt it, the undeniable, quiet tension that was growing between us. It was subtle, but it was real. For the rest of the evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something about her presence that made everything else seem secondary, more muted. I wasn't sure what this was, whether it was just the playful nature of her teasing or something deeper, but I knew one thing for sure: she had my full attention. And it was clear from that moment on that things wouldn't be the same between us. The days that followed felt like an extension of the quiet intrigue that had begun to unfold between Laura and me. I found myself at Mark's house more often than I had ever planned, each visit feeling less like a coincidence and more like a magnetic pull. Laura was always there, her presence now more familiar, yet no less captivating. We exchanged pleasantries each time, her playful remarks never failing to make me laugh, but I couldn't deny the undercurrent of something more, something that hovered between us, unsaid but undeniably present. Each time she looked at me, it wasn't the casual glance of someone just passing through. There was a weight to her eyes, a quiet recognition, as if she was studying me, understanding me in ways that I couldn't quite explain. Her gaze lingered, and though she rarely said anything overtly flirtatious, her words always seemed to touch something deeper inside me. "Why do you always look so serious?" she asked one afternoon, her voice warm but laced with curiosity. "You're here to relax, not to carry the weight of the world, you know." I tried to laugh it off, to brush it aside like I always did when someone pointed out the tension I carried, but there was something different about the way she spoke to me. Her words, so casual and almost teasing, somehow felt like a window into a side of me that I hadn't even fully recognized. It was as if she saw something in me that I hadn't shown anyone else, perhaps something vulnerable, something I hadn't yet allowed myself to acknowledge. Every time she was near, the space between us seemed to shrink, and it wasn't just the proximity of our physical bodies, it was something intangible, a connection that pulsed quietly in the air. When our hands brushed ever so slightly as we passed something to one another, the brief touch lingered in my mind far longer than it should have. It wasn't a gesture meant to convey anything, it was just a simple, accidental brush of skin, but it felt significant. Her presence seemed to make time slow down, and I couldn't help but notice how everything she did, the way she moved, the way she spoke, the way she laughed, left a trail that followed me long after the moments had passed. The conversations between us were simple. She spoke about books she was reading, music she loved, places she had traveled to. But each time she shared something, it felt like she was allowing me to see a little bit more of herself, her wisdom, her life experience, and a softness that she didn't readily show to everyone. I found myself drawn to her even more, but there was a hesitation, a fear of crossing an invisible line. It wasn't the age difference, nor the fact that she was my friend's aunt. It was the quiet, unspoken tension that hovered between us. I could feel the pull, the connection, but was it something real? Or was it just the way she made me feel, alive and seen in ways I had never experienced before? I often caught myself looking for moments where our eyes met, only to quickly glance away, unsure of what I was feeling or what I wanted. Yet every time I did, I couldn't shake the sensation that this thing, whatever it was quietly growing stronger. There was no rush, no pushing, but with each passing moment, the unspoken connection between us became harder to ignore. It was one of those quiet evenings when the world outside seemed to fade into a distant hum, and everything inside Mark's house felt slower, more intimate. The air was cooler, carrying the subtle promise of the coming evening, and the light from the fading sun cast a warm glow over the room. I had been sitting on the couch, lost in the soft murmurs of conversation between Mark and his friends, when Laura walked in, her presence instantly changing the atmosphere. She sat down next to me without much fanfare, her movements graceful yet relaxed. She didn't say anything at first, simply settling into the space beside me. There was an ease to her now that made everything else feel a little quieter, a little softer. I could feel the quiet hum of her presence without even looking at her, like the steady pulse of something familiar yet foreign. For a moment, neither of us spoke, and I found myself noticing the small details, the faint fragrance of lavender she always seemed to wear, the subtle way her fingers drummed lightly against the arm of the couch as she looked out the window. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, though, it was comforting, as though we were both content to exist in the same space without the need for words. It was she who broke the silence, her voice soft, but there was a weight to it, a softness that made me stop what I was doing and listen. "You ever think about how much we let time slip away from us?" she asked, her gaze now turning to meet mine. There was something vulnerable in her eyes, a quiet sadness that she didn't try to mask. I wasn't sure what she meant at first, but there was something about the way she said it that made me feel like she wasn't just speaking casually, she was sharing something deep. The playfulness that usually defined her demeanor was gone, replaced by a quieter, more reflective side of her that I hadn't seen before. It was in her eyes, that brief flicker of something fragile, something real, as if she was letting me in on a part of herself she didn't show anyone. "I've spent so much of my life moving from one thing to the next, just existing, you know," she continued, her voice low, almost to herself. "And then one day, you wake up and realize you've missed so much of the quiet moments. Those small pieces that make life feel alive." I could feel the weight of her words pressing down on me. For a moment, I was unsure how to respond. But I realized that, somehow, I understood. I had been running too, always chasing something, always preoccupied. And yet, here she was, speaking the truth I'd buried deep within myself, the truth that I'd never really allowed myself to feel. Time, life, had passed me by, just as it had for her. I didn't know how to fix it, how to ease the heaviness in her voice, but I did what I could. I simply nodded, my gaze not leaving hers. The quiet that followed felt different now, less like an awkward pause and more like a shared understanding between us. She smiled softly, almost as if relieved by my silence, and leaned just a little closer to me. Her shoulder brushed mine, and though the contact was fleeting, it felt like a quiet acknowledgement of the moment we had just shared, a moment that was both vulnerable and quietly intimate. And for the first time, I realized that the connection between us was not just physical, not just the playful teasing or the stolen glances. It was something deeper. Something real. It wasn't just the pull of attraction, it was the understanding of two people, in different stages of life, who had each felt the weight of time slip by unnoticed. It had become a routine of sorts. Every time I found myself at Mark's house, there was Laura, her presence almost magnetic. The banter between us continued, light-hearted and playful, but with each passing day, I could sense something more beneath her words. Her teasing, once casual, now carried a different edge, one that seemed to cut a little deeper. It wasn't just about my seriousness anymore, or the way I held myself when I was around her. It was almost like she was pushing me, testing the waters, to see just how far I'd go in acknowledging the tension between us. It was a warm evening when it happened. We were all gathered in the living room, the hum of conversations blending together as Mark and his friends argued over a movie they were planning to watch. I sat on the couch, a little detached, trying to absorb everything around me but failing to ignore the fact that Laura was sitting next to me, just a little too close. I could feel the subtle warmth of her body, the faint scent of her perfume filling the space between us. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it wasn't easy either. Her leg brushed against mine, and though it was brief, the contact sent an unexpected thrill through me. I could feel my pulse quicken, and I fought the urge to pull away, to create some distance between us. But she didn't pull back. Instead, she leaned in a little closer, her voice dropping to a softer tone as she whispered, "You're really serious, aren't you?" Her words were playful, teasing, but there was a knowing undertone in her voice, as if she were calling attention to something deeper. I could feel the weight of her gaze as she looked at me, waiting for a response. But I was frozen, caught somewhere between the desire to acknowledge the growing tension and the fear of crossing an invisible line that I wasn't sure I could come back from. "You should relax a little," she continued, a teasing smile playing at the corners of her lips. "You're not doing yourself any favors by staying so wound up." She lightly nudged my knee with hers, her fingers brushing against my skin just enough for me to feel the warmth of her touch. It wasn't a playful, innocent touch anymore. There was a subtle message in the way she lingered there, as if she was challenging me to relax, to let go of whatever I was holding on to. I wanted to say something, to respond, but my mind was racing. What was I supposed to say? How could I explain the mix of emotions swirling inside me? The attraction was undeniable, but it was more than that. There was something in her eyes, something unspoken that kept pulling me in. Her teasing wasn't just about making me laugh anymore, it was a way to test the waters, to see if I was ready to face what was between us. The room around us seemed to fade into the background, the noise of the others becoming muffled. All I could focus on was the way she was looking at me, the way her hand brushed against mine once more as she shifted on the couch, a soft, lingering touch that spoke volumes. I didn't know how to respond. I was caught between wanting to laugh it off, to keep things light, and the undeniable urge to lean into the closeness, to let the tension between us unravel. But for now, I stayed silent, my body still, my mind racing. The unspoken words hung in the air, and I knew, deep down, that things were shifting between us. What had once been playful teasing was now something more, a game with no clear rules, and I wasn't sure I was ready to play. It was another quiet evening, the kind where the world outside seemed far away, and everything inside Mark's house felt suspended in time. We had all gathered in the living room once again, but this time, the atmosphere felt different. The usual energy of the group seemed muted, and somehow, without even realizing it, the focus had shifted. There was just the three of us, me, Mark, and Laura, sitting together, and the distance between us felt closer than it ever had before. I found myself sitting on the couch, slightly to the side, but not entirely apart. Laura had taken a seat next to me, her posture relaxed but with a subtle tension that mirrored my own. The room was dimly lit, the soft glow of the lamps casting long shadows across the walls. The noise of the others had faded, as if we had slipped into a small, intimate bubble where only the three of us existed. We were talking, well, Laura and I were talking, while Mark listened passively, interjecting occasionally with a casual remark. But somehow, the conversation between Laura and me became more personal, more genuine. She asked me about things I hadn't expected, about my past, my dreams, the things that made me tick. And as I spoke, I found myself revealing more than I had anticipated. There was a vulnerability in the way she listened, as if she cared in a way that was unexpected, a depth that made it easy to speak freely. Her hand brushed against mine as she reached for the remote, and I felt the electric jolt of her touch linger in my chest. It wasn't a touch full of intent, yet it held something far more significant than any words could convey. I could feel the warmth of her hand, the softness of her fingers against my skin, and for the briefest of moments, it felt like time slowed. Her gaze met mine, and I saw something in her eyes that I hadn't seen before, something gentle and unguarded. She didn't look away this time, and neither did I. The quietness of the moment felt profound, as if the space between us had narrowed to something almost tangible. It wasn't a kiss, and it wasn't a declaration of love, but the closeness was undeniable. There was something in the air, something unspoken, that felt like the beginning of something real. Neither of us said anything, but in that brief moment, everything felt clear. The world outside faded, and all that was left was the soft weight of her presence beside me. And for the first time, I allowed myself to simply be in the moment with her, without any pretense, without any hesitation. It was one of those rare, quiet moments when the world outside seemed distant, and all that remained was the soft murmur of the evening around us. Mark had stepped out for a bit, leaving Laura and me alone in the living room. The house felt more peaceful without the usual noise, and yet there was an undeniable sense of anticipation hanging in the air. It wasn't something overt, but I could feel it, a subtle shift in the space between us, like two forces quietly tugging at each other, unwilling to go unnoticed any longer. I had been trying to ignore it, trying to pretend that the pull I felt toward Laura was just a figment of my imagination, a fleeting moment of weakness. But now, with only the two of us in the room, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The teasing, the glances, the touches, each one had only served to build something deeper between us, something I could no longer deny. We were sitting on the couch, a little closer than usual, our legs nearly touching. I could feel her warmth next to me, the subtle rhythm of her breath matching my own. For a moment, we just sat there in silence, neither of us willing to break the quiet tension, but I could feel the weight of her gaze on me. Her eyes were soft, but there was something in them, a question, an invitation, perhaps. Finally, it was as if I couldn't hold it back anymore. The words came out before I could stop them. Laura. I don't know what this is, but I can't ignore it anymore. There's something between us, and I feel it every time I'm near you. Her expression softened, and for a moment, she was silent, as if processing what I had said. I could see the hesitation in her eyes, the same conflict that I had been feeling but hadn't known how to express. She leaned back slightly, taking a deep breath, her fingers lightly brushing against mine as she spoke. I know, she said, her voice soft but steady. I've felt it too, and it scares me just as much as it scares you. I didn't know what to say. The relief I felt at having said the words was quickly replaced by a rush of nervous energy. But Laura simply smiled, a gentle, understanding smile, and the tension between us shifted, becoming something more open, more honest. It wasn't a definitive moment, not a resolution or a decision made, but it was the start of something real. For the first time, the air between us didn't feel charged with uncertainty. It felt like an unspoken understanding had formed, and whatever came next, at least we both knew we were no longer pretending. The vulnerability in that moment was raw, but it was also freeing, and it felt like the first step in something that could change everything. The days following our confession felt different, softer, yet filled with a quiet intensity. There was no rush to define what had happened between us, no pressure to act on every unspoken desire. Instead, we let the connection grow at its own pace, as naturally as the way the days turned into weeks. It felt like we were both testing the waters, exploring this new, uncharted territory where something more was blooming between us, but neither of us was willing to push too hard, too fast. We spent more time together, just the two of us. Whether it was over a casual dinner or a shared walk in the park, the moments felt more intimate, even though the words we shared were simple. It was the quiet moments that spoke the loudest, the way our hands brushed as we reached for the same glass, the way we lingered just a little longer than necessary when sitting side by side. There was a subtle shift in the way we interacted, a growing sense of familiarity and comfort. Every time I saw her, the pull between us was undeniable, but it was no longer just the attraction. It was something deeper, something unspoken but very real. Laura, too, seemed to open up in a way that I hadn't seen before. She laughed more freely, her smile no longer tinged with the careful control she had always held around others. There was a warmth to her now, a sense of ease that made her seem more approachable, more genuine. The walls she had carefully built around herself were slowly coming down, and I could see more of the woman behind the polished exterior, the vulnerable, thoughtful side that she had only hinted at before. It made me feel closer to her, as though we were no longer two people circling around each other, hesitant to move forward. We were becoming something more, in a way that felt comfortable and right. One evening, we sat together on the balcony, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. The warmth of the fading day wrapped around us like a blanket, and for the first time, the space between us felt completely natural, unguarded. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Laura's hand found mine, fingers intertwining in a soft, familiar gesture. It wasn't a grand romantic gesture, but it felt just as significant, like a promise, a quiet acknowledgement of everything that had shifted between us. Neither of us said much, but that simple touch spoke volumes. It was in the way she held my hand, in the way our fingers fit together so effortlessly. It wasn't just the beginning of something physical, it was the beginning of something emotional, something deep and real. We were no longer dancing around our feelings or holding back. We had both taken the leap, and in doing so, we found a new rhythm together, one that was slow, steady, and sure. For the first time, I didn't feel uncertain about what was happening between us. The tension that had once been so thick between us was now replaced with a quiet understanding. We were both ready to explore what this connection might become, without fear, without hesitation. And in that moment, with the sun setting behind us and the world feeling just a little more still, I knew this was just the beginning. The space between us had closed, not with a rush, but with the slow, steady pull of something real, something worth exploring together. Whatever lay ahead, we would face it side by side.